Hey guys, so it's been a while since I've recorded a watercolor walkthrough or tutorial, and I ran a poll over on YouTube asking you guys if you would prefer time-lapse videos, gentle narration, or text over, like music. And overwhelmingly, people said that they wanted gentle narration. So today's video is going to be that with some music. I don't intend to walk you guys through every single part of the process. So one thing I want to point out at the start of this is that this illustration had sat on a stretcher board for about a year, and the watercolor paper had spoiled. And it affects how the paints lay on the paper, but I decided I wanted to proceed with it anyway and see if there was any way I could paint something that I liked on this. So how do you know if watercolor paper has spoiled? And I think other artists may have different experiences than I do, so they're welcome to chime in the comments, and that might help more people, decide if it's worth trying or not. So I have painted on spoiled watercolor paper before and had to scrap it. I have done things that were just totally unworkable. So one of the ways you can tell is, it's hard to see in this video, but the way the paper is responding to the background that I'm trying to paint with this large soft Hake brush, that kind of tells me that there's just something wrong with the paper. So I decided to just kind of limit my scope. So instead of trying to do a bunch of layers or do contrasting shading or doing anything really complicated, I decided it would be better to just attempt a very straightforward watercolor illustration on this paper and see what it will allow me to do. The Frugal Crafter has a great video on working or deciding not to work with spoiled watercolor paper, where she paints a blue Maine crab and kind of explains the cons of persisting with painting on spoiled watercolor paper, and I highly recommend that you check that video out. I agree with pretty much everything that she has to say, and it also is why I say different people may have different experiences with paper spoilage, because I didn't find that the spoilage had gotten so bad that it was just completely unworkable. And since I really liked the line art for this illustration, I wanted to see what I could do with it. So one of the ways watercolor paper can spoil is that the gelatin that's used in the sizing can go off, and this will really affect how the paper actually handles water as well as watercolor when you apply it. So for me, what this meant is I can still do pour techniques. I can still do kind of like that loose brush technique that you guys saw for the background, but there is going to be a higher likelihood of bleeding, of feathering, of uneven drying, of patchiness or resist in some areas. There also may be difficulty in reworking some areas, or an area may relift completely. Sizing makes a really big difference in how the watercolor paper actually handles, and it also provides a lot of the structure inside the watercolor paper as well. How much those paper fibers open once the paper gets wet versus how it handles after it's dried again. So this is totally a your mileage may vary sort of situation. I'm not necessarily suggesting that you persist if you suspect that your watercolor paper has spoiled. For me, this was just like let me see what I can do with it. Let me see how far I can take this. Let me see if there's a way I can salvage it. So with that framework in mind, I was actually very satisfied with the resulting illustration. I think it turned out quite cute, and I'm really glad that I had persisted. But for the second book in my Lilliputian Living series, Les Petits Plaisirs de la Vie, the first version of the cover, when I had tried to paint that, the paper had spoiled, and it was just beyond something that I could work with. It was something just completely unsalvageable. So I did have to scrap that. So that's one of the reasons that I caveat this, that this is such a your mileage may vary sort of situation. So if you're like me and you kind of work on your illustrations in stages where you may have an inked watercolor illustration that is sitting stretched for a long period of time, something that you should keep in mind is, one, if your watercolor paper is in its pad and it's not exposed to just general air because it's in its pad or on a block, you should be fine. Sometimes it will spoil like that if long periods of time happen to pass, but in general, it should be all right. So you don't necessarily need to worry that the cotton rag paper you bought last year has spoiled already. However, if you do like to ink or pencil illustrations and then have them wait for you while you get around to them, dust and other atmospheric particulates, when they settle on the paper, they can actually cause the paper to acidify, and that can ruin the sizing. So one tip that I have, and it's definitely a year mileage, may vary sort of situation, is don't store your stretched watercolor illustrations where there might be a draft, where you might be getting air from outside, where your paper might be exposed to not air conditioned air, where there might be like large temperature fluctuations that can cause paper to spoil if it gets too hot or if it gets too cold, or areas of your home where there might be like humidity fluctuations, where it might get really damp and then it might get really dry. Another suggestion I have is actually to dust the paper off regularly using a drafting brush or a soft, clean, large hake or paintbrush to remove the dust from the paper surface, because I think I mentioned this earlier, but dust can actually bring acid to your paper surface and cause it to spoil faster. You could also try covering it with something like tracing paper just to prevent dust from actually falling on the illustration itself. Or you may decide to wait to stretch your watercolor illustrations. Just kind of by nature of my process, so I like to sketch digitally, and then I like to convert that to blue lines and print that on my watercolor paper. Then I need to work in a hurry, because if I don't work in a hurry, the dye will actually permanently stain the paper. So then I need to pencil it and either stretch it then or ink it and then stretch it. So basically, once I've printed an illustration, I need to get it stretched in that day if I want the blue lines to dissolve as much as possible. So that's how I often end up with these illustrations that are half finished and are basically just sitting out waiting for me to have time to actually paint them. So you guys can kind of see, okay, another thing that kind of saves this illustration is this is a larger illustration. It's not super teeny tiny little faces with lots of little details to paint. So if things get kind of blotchy, or if they get kind of feathered out or bleedy, it's way less noticeable. And even if it's noticeable, it isn't necessarily a detractant at this size. So the larger size really kind of helps save that. And you guys can see where we have some harsh edges on the gray as well as on the skin tone, some harsh edges on the sap green. And this is really exact. You'll get this with cellulose, and it's kind of a just common problem that you can kind of work around. And I actually have a tutorial where I talk in depth about how to successfully paint on less expensive watercolor papers if you're curious about that. But on cotton rag, especially, this is done on arches. That's far less common. And that's one of the ways you can kind of tell that your watercolor paper has started to spoil. So you guys can see I'm really trying to keep my techniques very simple, very straightforward, mainly limiting the water, mainly wet over dry. So I'm not attempting to do wet into wet blends. I'm not trying to do gradient blends. I'm not trying to do too many soft blended out areas. I'm basically working in very simple layers, kind of treating this paper as though it was a cheap cellulose paper that only has a limited amount of workability before it might turn to mud. And I think that's one of the reasons I was able to complete this piece in a way that feels satisfactory to me, is by focusing on just keeping it simple, but also by kind of modifying my expectations of what this illustration was going to look like and what I hope to achieve. So it was basically a salvage mission. On that note though, I did have a scan of the completed line art, and I will be sharing that over on my Patreon. So if you want to color along with me, whether you want to do watercolor, alcohol marker, color pencils, or crayons, whatever your heart desires, I'll have that over at patreon.com/nattasoup for you to color along with me. But that's also one of the things that I do whenever I am working on an inked illustration, is I will go ahead and scan the line art. And part of that is in case I ruin the watercolor, which isn't so much a problem anymore, but it does happen from time to time. I can always reprint it out and start again, but it also gives me an asset that I can share with my friends on Patreon. And also sometimes I just really like the line art, and over the years I may collect several line arts that I like and make a coloring book, like my coloring book Curious Little Things. So since this illustration, in terms of how I handled the watercolor, needed to be very simple, I decided that I wanted to really lean into the surface design on her skirt and on her sleeves, and that might bring some visual interest. So I'm starting with a very simple stripe pattern going horizontally, and then I'm going to go back over it and do it vertically. And I'm trying to keep in mind the volume and the shape of the folds as I'm adding this surface design. So that kind of creates a more believable illusion that this is more of a 2.5D or 3D illustration rather than just straightforward, illustration on flat paper. And I'm going to work on adding the surface design to her clothes in stages. I also kept the color palette for this illustration very, very, very simple. So now that I have our kind of checkerboard or our stripe pattern going on, I'm adding in a pattern of leaves using the sap green mixed with a little bit of undersea green, one of my favorite color combinations. And I'm also using this to kind of add in some, shadows and kind of clean things up in terms of the bouquet that she's holding. I also decided, or maybe I realized, that I hadn't done the sleeve. So this was a perfect opportunity to go back and do that. And I want to give a little shout out. Sometimes I like talking about the colors that I love. And I'm using Winsor & Newton's Rose Doré, D-O-R-E. Let me know if I said that correctly. I have taken a lot of years of French and I am terrible at French, so my pronunciation might be terrible, but it's such a beautiful color and it's really lovely for adding blush to cheeks and lips with lighter skin tones. I'm also using some of that ultramarine blue that I introduced earlier to add kind of, it's supposed to be like a hyacinth pattern on her dress. And again, I'm trying to keep in mind the form of the fabric and have the pattern sort of reflect that. So there's going to be areas where our hyacinths sort of dip into the creases and into the folds of the fabric. now that I'm almost finished, I want to add in some highlights. I'm going to use a little bit of white gouache to add highlights to her eyes, her eyelashes, and her hair. And this is another area where you can kind of see that the paper is not so receptive. It kind of blobs out and bleeds all over the place instead of holding its form. So this is another way that you can tell that your watercolor paper has spoiled. Another suggestion might be to, since watercolor paper has this lovely tooth to it, at least if you're using cold press, and it feels like such a shame to waste it, it might be really nice to bring in color pencils, watercolor pencils, or maybe even pastels if you're really set on utilizing and using that paper rather than having to chuck it or having to, severely change the scope of what you wanted to do. As I mentioned earlier, I was pretty fortunate. While there are some issues with the paper, it did not render the illustration unsalvageable, and I was still able to achieve something that I'm satisfied with. Although it did cause some areas of struggle, as you can see with how the highlight just kind of blobs out on her eyes there. So I'm really fortunate that this was a larger illustration where there was more room to be forgiving, where perfection and being tight and neat and exact are not as important. Hope this was as relaxing for you as it was for me, and hopefully I was able to share some pointers on maybe when you can still use your spoiled watercolor paper, or perhaps when it's a good time to throw in the towel and try something different. Thank you guys so much for joining with me today. It was a pleasure. I look forward to seeing you guys again soon with another art supply review or tutorial. If you're looking for more art tutorials, I have so many for you guys. Make sure you check the description down below. I hope this was inspiring for you guys, just like it was relaxing for me. And this was inspired by Kaiteki Art's tutorials. I love them. I love watching her videos. So hopefully I brought a little bit of the joy that I feel watching her tutorials and enjoying her art process. Hopefully I was able to bring that and share that with you guys today. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you guys soon. Here is our finished illustration, removing that blue tape. And just again, thank you guys so much for joining me. Let me know if you enjoyed this format. Let me know if you would like more videos like this, if you find it relaxing, because I have so many watercolor process videos that I could share with you guys in the same format. And I hope to see you guys soon. Bye guys!